We'll now take a look at what is oftentimes referred to as the pastoral epistles. That is 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. One of the biggest questions is about who wrote the pastorals. The internal arguments for Pauline authorships are the fact that Paul personally claims to have written these, but of course, just because someone claims to have written a letter doesn't mean that they did. Forgeries were done in the first century. Paul was aware that forgeries in his name were done. So just because there are someone does introduce themselves or indicate that they are Paul doesn't necessarily mean that that is actually what took place. There is a description of Paul's former life, and someone who thought that these letters were not written by Paul would have to explain why these former descriptions are included. But again, someone might say, well, the reason they're included is to give these letters a sense of authenticity. The author's relationship to recipients parallel information that we have about Paul in Acts as well as in other letters. But once again, if somebody wants to pretend that they are Paul or indicate that they are Paul and may be familiar with these letters or may be familiar with these individuals, it wouldn't be a surprise that they would include these names in order to give it a sense or a feel as if this was written by someone, by Paul himself. There are some external arguments for Pauline authorship. There are allusions from this letter by early Christian writers like Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Justin Martyr. Now, by allusion, I mean not things that are saying from the letter of 1 Timothy or anything like that, but we have words that occur in these authors' writings that are also words or phrases that occur in 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. So the question is, are these authors quoting from the pastorals, or is this just happen to be shared language that was written? So that's a question. Irenaeus is one of the earliest to confirm that these letters are written by Paul, and so he's in the 2nd century, late 2nd century. And so if someone was looking for where does the tradition really begin that accepts Pauline ascription to these letters, Irenaeus would probably be the source to be the kind of the beginning of it. There are arguments against Pauline authorship. People have noted that the personal elements of Paul fade into the background. So where Paul kind of talks about himself or refers to himself. Now there's some former descriptions, as I mentioned, that's in there, but not to the same kind of level, the same kind of consistency as we see in Paul's other letters, where he oftentimes talks about himself and his relationship with the people that he is writing to. The primary purpose of the letter seems to be to transmit regulations intended for others and not the addressees. But in the other letters, we have Paul writing directly to the congregation, to the Corinthians, to the Philippians, to the Thessalonians. But here he's writing to the Ephesians, or to the people living on Crete, but he does so via Timothy or Titus, so it's a bit different. Also, Hatation, who is a 2nd century Syrian apologist, someone who was defending Christianity, rejected 1st and 2nd Timothy as from Paul, but this may not be too much of a surprise since one of the descriptions of false teachers in 1st and 2nd Timothy are those who forbid marriage, and Tatian was someone who also taught against marriage for Christians. So you could see why Tatian may have not wanted to include these in his kind of canon. The pastorals are absent in the Chester Beatty papyri, so this roll does not include these sources. It has been noted as well, even though parts of that roll are missing from deterioration, it's thought that there still wouldn't have been enough for the scribe to have completely written the pastorals in the material that would have been left, the leaves that would have been left. However, it's also possible that scribes would start writing smaller and that the information could have been on those scrolls, but we don't know. The scroll, that part of the scroll is deteriorated or is missing, and we have no way of knowing for sure, but of the Chester Beatty papyri that we do have, it is not included in it. And the correct teaching is not presented here, but rather taken for granted. That might be a bit strange for the letter to Titus, since Crete is supposedly a young church, but it's not too surprising for 1st and 2nd Timothy, since Ephesus would be an older church. And if Paul has written the letter to the Ephesians, then they would have already known, or if they are people living in Ephesus, they would have been familiar with the Christian faith for quite some time. So correct teaching would not have to be presented in them. It should be taken for granted. Some other arguments against Pauline authorship. Well, it is difficult to find a place for the pastorals in the portion of Paul's life that is known to us. That is known to us via the book of Acts. Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome, and the traveling that Paul indicates he has done in the pastorals, we have no evidence that he made any of that travel. So that requires the theory that Paul was released after that first imprisonment in Rome, that first house arrest, that he did go on to Spain as he had told the Romans he wanted to, and that he ended up coming back to Crete and coming back to Ephesus and getting arrested eventually a second time and taken back to Rome, where he was eventually executed, according to tradition, under Nero, somewhere around 67, 68 A.D. But as we know right now, the travels that Paul indicates in these letters, we do not have evidence anywhere else in the New Testament of them. Now, one of the major things that are oftentimes cited for why this is not from Paul is that it is full of new vocabulary. They have the largest percentage of new words of any book in the New Testament, so that's something to consider. Some vocabularies, like the word Savior and appearance, seem to be used with more of a kind of a technical term that arises from the Hellenistic cults, especially the cult of the ruler. But of course, someone might be able to counter-argue and say, well, some of these vocabulary, some of these new words are used because Paul is dealing with a situation he has not dealt with in other places. So, for instance, as Ephesus is representative, it is the place where Timothy is at, and this letter is going to the Ephesians. Ephesus was a place where the imperial cult existed. Therefore, maybe some of this language from the imperial cult was utilized simply to address that situation that was prominent in Ephesus. The author does use vernacular designation instead of some of the original Pauline words. In these letters, we find the expression good conscience, to be sound, the grace that brings salvation. These are phrases that are frequent in Greek literature. They're not the type of phrases that Paul uses in the other letters. So, but once again, someone might say, well, the reason why he decided here to use them is he knows Timothy is going to be reading this letter to the audience, and he wants to use some of the vocabularies that are customary amongst the recipients. There also seems to be a concern for church organization. Some people claim that belongs to the 2nd century, in particular overseers, elders, deacons. But this is not a very strong argument because it does seem that Paul, from the book of Acts, that Paul was interested in church organization, establishing elders in the churches that he started. The letter to the Philippians recognizes the existence of overseers and deacons. So this argument does not seem to be as strong, and why can't Paul be interested in organization? That doesn't seem like something too far-fetched for Paul to be concerned with. So, and unlike the uniform presentation of regulations in the Didache, early Christian writing, the literary structure of 1 Timothy looks more like a collection of various materials. Somehow or another, they seem at times to have kind of a piecemeal effect to them. And for that reason, people think, well, this is really just kind of a collection of teachings by somebody, and they wanted Paul's support of these teachings, and so they ascribed them to Paul. but it's really a stitching of several different various instructions about support of widows and about elders and about behavior in the church. And so anyway, it's not as uniform, it's not as smoothly written. So those are some of the reasons for why there are arguments both for and against the authorship for this letter.